Good evening, hello and welcome. You're with the news today. This is your primetime destination news, newsmakers, talking points. Tonight, we will be bringing you ahead of the G20 summit this week, our G20 roundtable. How has Prime Minister Modi shaped G20? Will there be a Delhi declaration? We'll be focusing on all what lies ahead. We'll have guests from across India and the world. The G20 roundtable tonight is our special focus. But first, as always, it's time for the 9 headlines at 9. The countdown begins for the grand G20 summit in New Delhi. US President Joe Biden set to arrive in the national capital tomorrow morning to kickstart the high-profile summit with a bilateral with Prime Minister Modi. Technology transfer is top of the agenda. After Udaynidhi Stalin, now DMK MP A. Raja compares Sanatan Dharma to HIV and leprosy. Congress distances itself from the comments. Modi ministers demand an apology from the India alliance. Tamil Nadu Chief Minister MK Stalin comes in defense of his son. Big showdown over Bengal minority panel as it has only Urdu-speaking Muslims. BJP lashes out, asks why no Sikhs, Christian Jains in the committee. Suspense grows over a parliament special session. Angry opposition demands clarity. A Modi minister says don't politicize parliament. No consensus needed for a special session. As the political war over Bharat escalates, United Nations response says it will consider any formal request to change a nation's name. BJP claims no one should have any problem with the name Bharat. Muslim body decides to postpone an Eid procession by a day to avoid a clash with Anand Chaturdashi during Ganesh Chaturthi. Decision taken to ease the security arrangements, keep communal harmony in Mumbai. Rupee at a record low, the currency closes at 83.21 against the US dollar despite the RBI's intervention. Aditya L1 shares stunning selfie with Earth and Moon from space. ISRO announces the mission has attained a new higher orbit around the Earth.
India hosts world leaders. 85% of global GDP. 2/3 of world population. All set for G20 power meet. India rises as the voice of Global South. Ukraine war divides G20. Is China playing spoilsport?
Tensions between India and China affecting the summit, really that's up to China. If China wants to come in and play the role of spoiler, of course that option is available to them.
Will there be a Delhi declaration?
Hello and welcome once again to our special coverage. Remember, from tomorrow onwards, India will be the center of global attention when it comes to high-level diplomacy. India is on the high table as the host for the G20 summit. The summit itself will take place on Saturday and Sunday. But tomorrow it kickstarts with the US President Joe Biden arriving in Delhi and having bilateral talks with Prime Minister Modi. The summit is being seen as an attempt for India to showcase its belief that its time has come and that India should be on the global high table. Critics say that this presidency has come only through rotation and therefore the G20 still has a long way to go before India can claim to be driving it forward. What are the big questions that will be raised during this G20 summit? Why is this summit so important, both domestically and indeed globally? Those are some of the questions we will raise today. And what we've done on our global G20 roundtable is brought you guests from India and across the world. My guest tonight, Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States, is with us. Michael Kugelman is Director, South Asia Institute, the Wilson Center. Andrew K.P. Lewing is China strategist and analyst based in Hong Kong. Senya Kondratyev is a senior Russian journalist. She's covering G20 here. Russia has not sent its President Vladimir Putin. He hasn't come. Matthew Droin is visiting fellow Europe, Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So we have pretty much a large part of the world with us here today. Will diplomacy score over dazzle? Is the first question I want to raise, because there are lots of dazzling images Delhi has decked up for this event. But will diplomacy score over the dazzle? Meera Shankar, is this about optics, or do you believe that something substantive will be achieved in this G20 summit? And if so, what can be achieved?
Well, I do hope that we are able to achieve something substantial. As of now, it looks like the issue of Ukraine is holding up a consensus on a joint statement. And it should be our endeavor to try to insulate the differences that have arisen over the Ukraine conflict and move ahead on global challenges which are becoming increasingly urgent and which require action by all countries. So that's my hope. I'm not sure that the hope will be fulfilled. I think we have to wait and see. As of now, the world is more divided than it has been for a very long time, because the relationship between the great powers have become increasingly fraught. This was not the case when the G20 was set up. And at that time, it was able to make substantive progress after the 2008 financial crisis on stabilizing the global economy, having a coordinated stimulus, putting in place regulations for banking and banking norms. But today, I think it's become much more difficult to achieve consensus. But I do hope that we can insulate or isolate these geopolitical differences and move ahead on substantive issues of climate change, climate finance, how to strengthen international cooperation in the event of another pandemic, how to accelerate the global economy, which is in a downturn right now, and how to accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think these are all issues which are of great urgency for the world. And I do hope we can focus on these and get something substantial.
Let me bring in Michael Kugelman at this moment. Michael Kugelman, you heard from Meera Shankar. There is hope that we can overcome the sharp divisions that have emerged, particularly post-Ukraine, in what is increasingly seen as a multipolar world. China and Russia not sending, the presidents of the two countries not coming. Do you believe that the G20 can really overcome the deep divisions that lie post-Ukraine and come together on issues of commonality, be it climate change, be it a way to find economic sustainability, a way out of the debt crisis? Do you believe these are issues that can be wrestled with in a two-day summit and a Delhi declaration can emerge?
Well, I fully agree with Ambassador Shankar that the challenge for India as host is to put up some type of firewall between the difficult, complex, controversial geopolitical issues and then the many less controversial issues where you really can get a consensus. And she had mentioned some of those you have as well. Something like membership for the African Union. That's something I would see as a low-hanging fruit. One issue where one would think that a consensus can be generated. And I think also look at last year at the Bali declaration after the G20 meeting in Indonesia last year. There was a lot of division and tensions with the G20 membership then as well, but they still came out with the statement. It was watered down a bit, but one thing it did that was quite clever, and I think that may happen this year as well, is that where there were cases of disagreement, that was denoted by using text such as most members believe or many members believe. Clearly that doesn't reflect a consensus. But I think it's more important to have a document, a joint statement, that conveys a lack of consensus than no joint statement at all. I think the optics of there not being a joint statement would be very suboptimal, certainly for New Delhi as host, but also for the G20 on the whole. You really need to have that. But keep in mind that to this point, every ministerial level G20 session that has happened under India's presidency has not created some type of consensus document. So certainly the stakes are high, but I do think it is possible to come out with some type of statement that reflects not a total consensus, but at least a partial one.
Andrew, KP Lewing, as we've seen and was mentioned by Michael Kugelman, over the last year, since India took over the presidency, we haven't had a consensus on any of the major issues. When the finance ministers also met in Bengaluru, there was hope that there would be a consensus on trying to push for financial stability. That didn't happen. Do you believe, as there are those in this country, that China in particular does not want to, is being seen as some kind of a hurdle towards building this consensus? I want to, before I come to you, just play what the US said about China, and then I want you to respond to that. Are the Chinese going to be seen as the country that will prevent a consensus at G20? Just listen in for a moment, and I want you to then respond on the role that China intends to play at the G20. Listen in.
As far as the question of tensions between India and China affecting the summit, really that's up to China. If China wants to come in and play the role of spoiler, of course that option is available to them. What I think the chair, India, will encourage them to do, what we, the United States, and every other member, virtually every other member of the G20 will do, is encourage them to come in a constructive way on climate, on multilateral development bank reform, on debt relief, on technology, and set aside the geopolitical questions and really focus on problem solving and delivering for the developing countries.
Can we be optimistic that China will set aside differences, focus on areas of convergence?
Well, first of all, China is a very staunch supporter of international trade. China is the world's largest trading partner, and 130 countries have China as the largest trading partner. We'll compare with the United States 58. And of course, China's economy depends on international trade and international cooperation. And so China supports a more multipolar world order where all countries are treated equally and play a part. I think that this is exemplified by the current meeting also going on in ASEAN, where, of course, the ASEAN members, together with China, India, and other countries, have formed the world's largest trading bloc, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, according to a third of the world's GDP and a third of the world's economy. So I don't think that China wants to be a spoiler in the G20. But China is represented very strongly by its Prime Minister. But I agree that there are very serious dividing lines. The G20 is supposed to address the world's most pressing problems. Now, what are the world's most pressing problems at the moment? It's the Ukraine war, on which not all sides agree with the American rhetoric of sanctioning Russia. That's the end game. Even India is not on all fours with the United States. And then, of course, there is the almost at war kind of confrontation between the United States and China, disrupting global supply and value chains. And then all this rhetoric about democracy against autocracy, which without regard to the outcome of various political models, whether the countries, the people under different ideologies have seen their lives miraculously improved, regardless of the ideology. So there are lots of dividing lines. And the trick of the G20 is not to find the lowest common denominator, but the highest common denominator, focusing on common issues like climate change. And even there's considerable difference between the global south and the advanced countries in terms of financial aid to the global south. But I think that some form of words could be found. But the most important thing is not the form of words, it's the political will that can be mobilized behind the statement.
Right. Can I, you mentioned that among the challenges is Ukraine. And many believe that is the one issue on which eventually Russia and China will converge and will prevent a declaration coming out, because there is an unwillingness to openly condemn the Russians, certainly on the part of the Chinese. Ksenia Kondratevya, you're joining us as a Russian journalist who's here to cover the summit. What are the expectations the Russians have from it? Does Russia feel isolated now in this new world order that's emerging, particularly post-Ukraine?
Well, you would see the Russian officials, including a Russian foreign minister today in ASEAN summit. You just Google and the photos that are coming, he's surrounded by, the world leaders. I don't really buy that argument that Russia is isolated, especially post Ukraine conflict. Russia has a very difficult, if at all, relationship is left with the West, but is the West the world? I think Russia has made it pretty clear that it doesn't consider the West as any majority in the world. Okay, they may be influential economically, but I think Russia is quite open to cooperating with its partners in Asia, in Africa. We just had a Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, my home city, and it was a tremendous show up of...
No, for that very reason, I'm sorry, how invested is Russia in G20? If you're creating alternate blocks, including BRICS, other blocks across the world, is Russia invested in a bloc where the Americans are seen to play a major role? Is Russia willing to invest its equity in such a bloc like G20 in your view?
See, you are right saying that G20 was set up as a bloc under the influence of US, but you see the G20 today, you see the kind of discussions are taking place. I think, and that's why India is actually playing a major role, and we should just laud India for whatever it's doing during its presidency, because it's clear to everyone that there are cracks for G20, and maybe these cracks are for good. That is something we are yet to see. But whatever India has done within its presidency is just showing that the fact that there is no consensus, because you are saying that Russia, China, trying to block the resolution, but Russia and China probably see the other way around, right?
Okay.
So I think there are cracks in G20. I think G20 is changing itself, and the world is changing itself. The number of times that we heard words like, multipolarity, multilateralism from Russian, Chinese, or Indian officials, we hear these words every day, and this is not something that has been happening 2, 3, or 5 years back. So I think you should see G20 evolving.
Okay, you're saying the G20 is evolving in a way that it is no longer America-centric, certainly. Is it Europe-centric? Matthew Droin, the flip side, as was just mentioned by my senior Russian guest, is that we are looking at China and Russia as potential spoilers. The flip side would be, is the Western world willing to do more? Is it willing to accommodate concerns that the global South, which the Prime Minister of India now wants to champion, Mr. Modi wants to champion, on issues like climate change, on issues like providing greater economic equality, on these issues? Is the Western world willing to do more to reach out? Or do you believe that Russia and China alone must be seen almost as the villains of the piece?
I think the answer is yes. And I think from the onset, the G20 has been created to build bridges between the West and the rest of the world. And I think that the most Western capitals are happier with dealing with the G20 than dealing with the BRICS, for instance, in the formats from which they are not present. And I think it's also fair that the G20 is also representative of new balances in the world order. You mentioned economy. China represents, according to the IMF, 35% of world economic growth. India is 15%, and Americas are only 14%. So I think this is an important venue even for Western capitals, and I think they are pretty happy and comfortable with India taking the lead, because India is part of the Quad security dialogue in the Indo-Pacific. From my home country, France has very strong ties with India. And I think they really see India as a bridge with the so-called global South to work on issues, critical issues. We talked a lot about Ukraine, but climate change, new governance for international finance. These are very critical issues, and I think the West is really comfortable with the G20 as the main venue to tackle these.
Let's turn therefore to that question, which comes from what was just mentioned about the role that India has to play. How has Prime Minister Modi's leadership shaped G20? That's the second question we want to pose here. Meera Shankar, there's a lot of hype. India is projecting itself as a Vishwa Guru. Critics will say this has come by pure rotation, the presidency. Prime Minister Modi wants to see himself as a leader of the global South. There's a push for the African Union to be made a member. Do you see what's happened in the last 12 months in a way giving India a leadership position within the G20? Or is that a bit of a stretch to say simply because by rotation we've got the presidency, we can actually claim that we are driving the G20 forward?
Well, we have got the presidency as a result of rotation, but India has taken its presidency quite seriously and has sought to shape an agenda going forward. So irrespective of whether we get full consensus or not on a range of issues, I think we should be able to move the needle forward on some of them. And these are issues which require multidimensional action over several years. These are not issues which are going to be solved overnight. But we have put forward fairly substantial proposals on the table, easy ones to take decisions on: membership of the African Union, rescheduling debt, where China is a holdout. It doesn't want to join a common platform for rescheduling debt of the developing countries, expanding the mandate of the multilateral funding agencies, the World Bank, IMF, and others, to include global public goods. Now, that should be easy enough for people to agree on. Recapitalizing the banks may take more time, for instance, to reach a consensus on. Similarly, the issue of climate finance may take more time to reach a consensus on, but say, for instance, recapitalizing the banks. There's a report which India had commissioned, done by Larry Summers and N.K. Singh, which talks of how the banks could be recapitalized, having recourse to the market, but also expanding concessional lending for the least developed countries. So those are ideas which are going to be on the table, and I would hope that they shape the agenda going forward. For instance, in the health sector, I think there's an agreement that WHO will try to create a digital platform which will integrate all the digital platforms that were set up at a national level to deal with COVID. So that would be a great help to countries, because all information would be available at one place, and it would be easy to follow also what other countries are doing. So this is another area where progress seems to have been made. But all of this depends on getting a final consensus on the joint statement, or consensus on an outcome document which sets out the areas where countries have agreed to take follow-up action.
But the fact is that, just to stop you for a moment, because this whole notion of the global South, Michael Kugelman, there are those who will say that this is the role that India has chosen to play. As Meera Shankar said, India has taken its G20 presidency very seriously. We made the effort to pitch ourselves as a leader of the global South and to make the West aware that some of these concerns on financial inclusion, on debt restructuring involve giving the global south its due, the African Union possibly as a future member. Do you see that the West sees, America sees India's role in the way India perceives it, that we have taken a leadership position as a potential leader of the global south to redraw in a way the global balance of power?
Well, I'm sure that the U.S. acknowledges and indeed recognizes that that role that India sees itself playing as a bridge to the global south. But it's an especially important role to play, I would argue, in that we talk so much about the great power rivalries playing out within the G20, but I would argue that it's not only the fault lines don't only lie in the great power rivalries; they also lie to some extent between the West and the global South, right? I mean, we know that, for instance, I would think that some of the developing countries in the G20 would want the U.S. and other wealthier countries from the West and the developed world to provide more assistance, more financial assistance on climate change mitigation and adaptation than the richer countries may be willing to provide. So I think this is a time when it's especially important for India to be championing the needs, the demands of the global South, for sure. But I think that the U.S. recognizes that India's presidency in the G20 has served a variety of functions, all very beneficial for the most part. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, there are areas of disagreement between the U.S. and its fellow developed countries in the G20 mm-hmm. and countries in the global South, particularly when it comes to how much assistance, how much financial assistance to provide to help the global South address these very serious challenges, climate change, food insecurity, that impact the global South disproportionately.
And Andrew, your sense, how does China see India's role? The fact that India is the host, the fact that we have had serious border challenges, how does China, in your view, see India's presidency?
Well, I think it's instructive that both President Xi and President Modi have recently agreed to de-escalate the border disputes, because both countries realize that there is no point continuing arguing and confronting each other over something that has been hanging over so many years. But rather than spending the time and effort on global challenges and regional challenges. Now, as far as the G20 is concerned, first of all, it is by no means regarded as a rival bloc, or even the word bloc is wrong in a multipolar world, with what's happening with the BRICS country, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on and so forth. But there are deep fault lines in sort of disagreements. For example, the reform of the IMF, for example, the International Monetary Fund, has been a great deal of talk over the past decades, and nothing gets changed because the United States still want to retain its blocking vote in this international financial institution. But there are a common agreement, for example, on the pandemic, on sharing of health safety equipment, health safety products, and sharing the kind of technology and pharmaceuticals, and climate change. Of course, there is a substantial agreement on mitigation, various other measures countries can build up. And even in global conflicts, I think there is very little disagreement that countries don't want wars necessarily. So I think that the G20, the magic of diplomacy is to seek the highest common denominator, while not relying on words only, because words won't change anything, but then to capture the kind of domestic political dynamics that could coalesce into an agenda that would be comfortable with the participating countries in the G20.
But is there just to very quickly, is there full trust that the Chinese, how does China see Mr. Modi's leadership?
Well, the leadership is by rotation. So I think that China doesn't want to challenge this leadership, because this is
Mr. Modi the individual. Mr. Modi the individual.
No, I don't think that China wants to make an enemy with President Modi, and in fact that's China's policy all along in other groups in like the BRICS, like the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and so on and so forth. There's a great deal of multipolar sharing of power, sharing of positions.
Right.
I don't think that just China's policy to divide the world into two blocks, in spite of the rhetoric in some other countries. Because the whole world is so much interconnected. We all live in a global village. And of course, some countries have a larger size. Some countries are more endowed with natural resources. But that's the reality. And I think that China's policies all along is that to accept differences. Of course, there are differences, but differences doesn't have to translate into confrontation. Okay. So there's a very common Chinese saying that harmony can be achieved despite deep differences. There is a kind of holistic approach that lends itself both in Eastern philosophy, including the philosophy in India.
How does the absence of Xi and Vladimir Putin affect the summit? And what are the hitches that lie ahead is my next question that I want to pose. Let me turn to you, Ms. Kondratiebbia. Vladimir Putin didn't go to the last G20 summit in Bali. He's not coming to Delhi. What is Russia's minimum expectation from this summit? In Bali, there were concerns, and I want to play what before I come to you, what the Prime Minister had said then about war, and that had in a way reflected in that Bali summit. And then I'll come to you, ma'am. Just listening to what Prime Minister Modi had said at the time ahead of the Bali summit when he had met with Vladimir Putin. Listen in.
एक्सेलेंसी मैं जानता हूं कि आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं, और हमने फोन पर भी कई बार आपसे इस विषय में बात की है कि डेमोक्रेसी और डिप्लोमेसी और डायलॉग, ये सारी बातें ऐसी हैं कि जो दुनिया को एक स्पर्श करती है। आने वाले दिनों में शांति के रास्ते पर हम कैसे बढ़ सके। भारत और रशिया के संबंध अनेक गुना बढ़े हैं। हम इन संबंधों को इसलिए भी महत्व देते हैं कि हम एक ऐसे मित्र रहे हैं जो पिछले कई दशकों से हर पल एक दूसरे के साथ रहे हैं, और पूरी दुनिया भी जानती है कि भारत के साथ रशिया का नाता कैसा रहा है और रशिया के साथ भारत का नाता कैसा रहा।
Ms. Kondratiebbia, what is the minimum expectation the Russians have? If the Americans and the other countries want a firmer stand to be taken on the war in Ukraine, how will Russia respond?
Russia has been very clear on its position, and I think it resounds with India's position that this is not the forum to have a stand on Ukraine. And, as a journalist covering the G20 summit, not for the first time, the only coverage of the summit that we see in most of the media is just how the Ukraine issue will play out and how it will affect the consensus. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows what else is being discussed in the G20 summit unless you are from the particular beat of finance or clean energy or something else, So G20 has to discuss a lot of issues the developing world is facing, and that is what Indian speakers and I believe Russian speakers have been stating. The Ukraine issue does affect the world because of sanctions. So do sanctions, unilateral sanctions, do they have place in this world where economy has been globalized? I think this is something that Russia is going to bring to the table and is going to discuss. And this is a major thing.
But can we see what we saw? Will we see even what we saw in Bali, where there will be some kind of growing concern expressed over the use of aggression, territorial aggression against another country? Will the Russians be willing to accept even any minimal condemnation at all on use of territorial aggression, or that's off the table?
Russia's position hasn't changed. So I don't see why we would be discussing that any language. Russia said that it will not accept, and it does not accept the language, and including the Ukraine issue on Bali agenda, because there are other issues to discuss.
Right. So but would Russia accept that this is not the age of war? Would they even accept that minimal stand which India had I mean, that we cannot be in the age of war?
In fact, Russian president and other officials have stated multiple times that there should be negotiations. Mm-hmm. They have also stated multiple times that Ukraine is not ready to negotiate. There is a law in Ukraine that prevents the president of Ukraine and other officials to negotiate. They have passed the law a year back. So I understand it can be a formality, but then there is such law. There is no such law in Russia. There are many other laws in Russia, but there is no such law in Russia that Russia cannot negotiate peace. But then the ground for this negotiation has to be created, and I think the global community has completely failed, unfortunately, so far, to create any ground for for proper negotiations. And unfortunately, the conflict is still on.
Matthew Droin, will Ukraine shadow this summit in the way it did Bali last year? Or do you believe the countries have recognized there's far too much of areas of convergence that need to be worked on, and therefore, whether it's climate change, which I'll come to in a moment, these are the real issues of our times that we need to work forward to, not become Russia-centric or Ukraine-centric?
Well, the thing is, it's hard to disconnect the Ukraine-Russia topic with the rest of the global challenges because, of course, it's a geopolitical challenge issue, but it has a dramatic impact on issues like food security, on energy. So it's hard to disconnect, and of course, it will be central, and also because it's a very divisive issue. But as you mentioned, a consensus was reached in Bali. It puts Russia in a very difficult position. It puts Russia in the corner. It's either they join the consensus, which I think the Prime Minister Modi is very adamant on the issue, or they dissociate themselves, which also has important political costs for Russia. So yes, I expect Ukraine to be top of the issues, and I expect that it won't take hostage other important issues, as you mentioned, climate change, the reform of economic and financial governance, and support to the fight against poverty and against climate change.
Let's come to climate change in a moment, because this is one of the great issues of our times, the 21st century challenge. Will climate change, or has climate change taken a backseat because of geopolitical concerns post-Ukraine in particular, and also the financial crises that many countries are going through post-COVID? Meera Shankar, the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has been a great champion of the Solar Alliance, for example. But do you believe that climate change, and is that also a divisive issue, that there's a sense that the global south believes that the Western world needs to do more and vice versa?
Certainly, I think climate change is one of the most important issues before us. You've seen, we've had a burning summer this year, the hottest on record in many countries. Forest fires across Europe and the US. In India, temperatures over 42 degrees even in September. So you can see that the impact is already being felt. But it hasn't got the attention it deserves because of geopolitical differences. And I think that's a pity, because, the one virtue of the G20 was that it straddled two divides. It was the one grouping, other than the UN, which was seen as too cumbersome, which straddled the East-West divide, because you had the US and West on the one hand, Russia and China on the other hand as members, and it straddled the North-South divide. It had a large number of emerging economies, many developing countries and developed countries as part of the grouping. So it was seen as being, a grouping which could, forge consensus on issues which had divided the world. particularly those which are global challenges and not of a geopolitical nature.
But we haven't even reached a consensus on the G20 Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group, which met in July. They concluded without a final communique on climate change. You know, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, India opposing a proposal by Western countries to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030, cut greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2035. So even on climate change, there seems to be no consensus.
Yes, it isn't. There isn't a consensus, unfortunately, even on the issue of climate finance. You know, how much will the Western countries and the developed world put on the table to facilitate adaptation and mitigation, particularly by the least developed countries, which are facing enormous economic challenges at the present and are highly in debt. So I think that it's one issue which hasn't got the attention it deserves and which hasn't made the progress that the world should expect at this juncture.
Michael Kugelman, do you believe that even on this issue, surely on climate change, the world should be coming together?
Well, I mean, we have seen a new emerging norm over the last few months, in that the last UN climate summit produced an agreement, a new loss and damage fund, which essentially entailed the richest countries in the world agreeing that there is an obligation to provide assistance to the poor countries who disproportionately suffer from climate change effects. So you have a new emerging norm. You also, looking at the U.S., the Biden administration has made very clear that it wants climate change to transcend great power rivalry. The administration has said that it wants to be able to cooperate with China on dealing with climate change, despite all the problems in the relationship. And, I read your Prime Minister's op-ed that he published today. Much of the op-ed focused on climate change. So clearly, with key players within the G20, there is a strong desire to try to figure out a way to move forward and make climate change a part of the final document in some way. But indeed, it's going to be very tough, as Ambassador Shankar said, as I said before. Even what may seem like the low-hanging fruit items, like climate change, have a lot of landmines to them. In that, yes, I mean, you have a lot of countries in the developed world that are not willing to commit as much assistance as the global South countries would like to see. If they can get through that issue at this summit, if they can work something out there, I think that could perhaps be some major breakthrough. But it certainly won't be easy, even though you do have this emerging norm that recognizes the importance of the wealthier countries providing climate-related assistance to the developing countries.
Okay, so let me go one last time round the table and ask the big question. Will there be a Delhi declaration? Will we see at least a broad consensus on certain financial issues of restructuring of multilateral institutions, on debt servicing? Are these at least issues that will find their way into a Delhi declaration, or will the more trickier issues like Ukraine prevent such a declaration from emerging? Why don't you start, Mr. Leung, your sense from Hong Kong there? Do you see a broad consensus being achieved of a kind that was in Bali, but really, as we've seen in the last year, there hasn't been any sense of unity or purpose for all the razzmatazz? We haven't seen consensus when it comes to brass tacks. Will that change, you believe, in the next 48 hours?
Well, the world is in such a bad state. And then with political rivalry, the war, and also developing countries in debt and the rise of the global South. And I think there is too much at stake for President Modi to be seen to fail in achieving a statement. So I do believe there's going to be some sort of a statement, but the statement is going to seek highest common denominator, as I said, and climate change is the most fruitful area. And then, of course, there are stumbling blocks over climate change, but there is sufficient consensus on the embracing electric vehicles, employing renewables, and of course, as far as China is concerned, it's in China's interest to grow its Belt and Road Initiative to build infrastructure, especially infrastructure more amenable to the concerns of climate change. So I do think that China, that's why China is sending its prime minister over and would be expecting a bigger role, and then trying to ally with the Global South to achieve a common statement together with India as the host.
Senior Kondratevya, are you hopeful? Ms. Kondratevya, are you hopeful of a joint statement? A joint declaration?
Frankly speaking, I do not think that if there is a declaration or if there is no document, it's gonna either end the conflict in Ukraine or it's gonna end the existing problems of the of the global world, be it debt crisis or especially the climate change. So what I believe is that the countries stay firm on their priorities and continue doing what they're doing. And I think I'm again just, referring to India, what it is doing globally, not just within India, but within the region and in Africa, for example, in terms of all these issues from finance, from sharing its achievements in technologies, in finance, in tackling climate. I think if countries keep doing and keep spreading the good practices, and that's what I believe Mr. Modi is doing, that will help, and it will continue irrespective of whether there is a consensus or not, and that is what is important.
Okay, Matthew Droyne, your sense, what could be the biggest takeaway you believe from this G20 summit? What's the hope?
Yes,
what's the expectation?
Sure, I'm personally optimistic that there will be a final communique, for three reasons. Maybe first, because it's fair to remember that G20 declaration is not non-binding for the states, so there is less impact. Second is nobody wants, I think, to embarrass the Indian presidency. So I think in the end they will agree, if not on the highest common denominator, as Mr. Long said, at least on the lowest common denominators on several issues. I think some issues are mature enough to have some ambitious targets, for example, on biodiversity, and some others, as we mentioned, Ukraine, for instance, will be more difficult, but I'm fairly optimistic that there will be a text adopted.
So you're optimistic that there will be a text. Michael Kugelman, is it absolutely necessary for India to declare the summit a success for there to be a Delhi declaration? Or do you believe the fact that countries are looking for areas of convergence should be in itself seen as a positive?
Well, very briefly, the Indian government has invested so many diplomatic resources in this enterprise, and certainly Prime Minister Modi has invested a lot of political capital in getting a successful summit at play. So indeed, I think that while the government would likely declare success no matter what happens at the end, I think you really need to have some type of final product, some type of joint statement for this truly to be a success. And so I would agree with what the previous speaker said. I think that there will be some type of final document, even if it doesn't reflect a total 100% consensus. It's going to be hard to get that, but you need to get some type of product out there just to show that all members had an important negotiation and that they've come out with some key principles, even if watered down.
Meera Shankar, in conclusion, what could that be, therefore? Even let's assume in the worst case scenario, we don't have a complete consensus on all issues, which seems difficult at the moment. Is there a minimal consensus, the low-hanging fruit, that could eventually become form of a Delhi declaration?
I would hope that there is a Delhi declaration, because the world has too much riding on making progress on the issues and challenges that we face. If there is no declaration, I think what India has done will shape the agenda going forward. Those issues, those proposals are not going to disappear. They are going to shape the agenda going forward in the Brazilian presidency. So you're going to hear more about the proposals that have been put on the table, including, recapitalizing and reforming the multilateral funding agencies or banks, including on digital infrastructure, digital
cryptocurrencies. I mean, there are areas of concern over cryptocurrency, over the way multilateral financial institutions can widen their ambit. Do you see all of that becoming part of a consensus document at least?
Some of it could. I don't know if everything will become part of it. Yes, we have been discussing the issue of cryptocurrencies and regulating that, providing a regulatory framework. Also, narcotics, I think, is something which has figured for the first time in the G20 in a substantive way. There have been discussions on, startups and what can be done globally to facilitate startups and small and medium scale industries. So there have been a range of new issues on the table, as well as the old issues on which we have made substantive proposals. I would certainly hope that, we are able to get over our differences or find ways of dealing with them and having a joint statement.
Okay.
Yes, the Ukraine conflict is a complex conflict. There are legitimate views on both sides. And India has taken a neutral position on the conflict. Because of this, we understand that there is a history to the conflict. We understand that both countries see it as an existential problem to their very existence. So it is a complex problem. But having said that, India would like to see progress towards peace in Ukraine, but it doesn't want the Ukraine issue to block consensus on global challenges, because at the very minimum, despite geopolitical differences, the great powers have to find ways to work together on these global challenges which don't respect boundaries and which require action by everyone. Otherwise, it would be irresponsible global citizenship.
Let me leave it there. Let's hope that, therefore, we are able to find those areas of convergence. Post-COVID, post-Ukraine, the world has multiple challenges, and what it needs is to find ways out on a variety of issues, from climate change to financial sustainability to finding ways in which the world can perhaps be bridge builders. G20 can be a bridge builder rather than become yet another force of division. I thank all my guests for joining us. You've come from different corners of the world to join me on this program, and that perhaps reflects in a way the spirit of G20, the idea that the world can be one family. We live in hope, or as they say in this part of the world, Umeed pe duniya kayam hai. Thank you all very much for joining me.